Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm from Project 90. We're a change-focused organization, aim to inspire positive change in the way humans interact with Earth systems. And our sort of motto is to inspire and mobilize society towards sustainable development and equitable low-carbon future. CPLO, whose logo is up there, that's Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office. So they are sort of an official vehicle between the Catholic Church and the Parliament of South Africa. The broad scope of this topic is a just energy transition. What we're talking about is moving to an energy system which is better for people and the planet, but also things like inequality, socio-economic development. You know, we were looking to move to a better space.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for turning up. It's nice to see so many people here. I want to start up front by saying that we can't underestimate the difficulties of moving towards a just energy transition. It's obviously an enormous undertaking, and I think what we're doing with this research is we're just opening up the debate. We don't claim to have all the answers, but it's a way that we can sit today and we can stimulate debate around what a just energy transition is and what does it look like in South Africa. The word just and its implications for social justice means that you can't just have a kind of narrow understanding of this process of moving towards a different type of energy system. Justice implies politics. So obviously there's a hugely political dynamic to this process. And whilst there's lots of contested ideas around what a just energy transition is, there's three predominant ideas. There's this kind of hyper-capitalist version, then there's the green economy version of a just energy transition, and then there's one that we've described as a transformative change. The hyper-capitalist version is about the increased commodification of nature. So, for example, a forest would be considered worthwhile to the so-called market because it would be a carbon sink, whereas a desert would be something that can be dispensed from an environmental point of view. So nature is completely commodified, it's valued, it's given arbitrary values, and it's traded. And a transition from a kind of a brown energy source to a green energy source is then seen as an opportunity for increased profit. And the demand of the kind of eco-modernists and the kind of hyper-capitalists is for less regulation rather than more regulation of energy. So what happens is the market decides what is best. The idea being that the market will make rational choices and that justice will then allegedly come from the kind of trickle-down economic effect of economic growth. Then we have the green economy version, which still continues to see energy as a commodity that can be traded. It's largely market-driven, but it does have some kind of welfarist, reformist tendencies. And we see this classic example is in the REAP project. It's largely driven, it's a government policy, it's largely driven by the private sector, but it does have this kind of welfarist attitude in the sense that there's community development as an intrinsic part of it, although a very junior part of the actual program. So it's a sense in which there's a recognition that if you just let the market decide, there will be winners and losers. So it's an attempt to try and address those so-called losers. So in a sense, it's where brown jobs transition to green jobs, and then those that miss out in that process can turn to kind of state support and reformist tendencies. And then there is the transformative change. So this sees energy as part of the global commons, as a common good and a common right that all of us have an intrinsic right to. And I think it's useful to remind ourselves that before the so-called energy liberalization in the 1980s and the 1990s, energy was considered as a common good, and state-owned energy companies were providing a service. There was a notion of equity behind it, and it was only through the gradual privatization that it became something that was traded on, in a sense, in a market, and became something which capitalist relations could start making money out of. So I think sometimes we can kind of get lost in the thinking that, the market's in control, how do we transform? But we must remember it's very recently that we have the situation we have at the moment. And what it does, it rejects the free market in favor of the democratic control of energy. And by democratic, that means at least 51% of citizens will be involved in terms of their voting rights, in terms of the control over decision-making around energy. And local ownership, well, that's obviously self-explanatory. It means that the energy, that whatever it may be, a wind farm, is then owned by people that actually live near the wind farm, experience any negative impacts of the wind farm, and will hopefully benefit from any profits that the wind farm may make in terms of money being returned back to the community. And I think the objectives then are completely different, because the objectives are affordability and accessibility. So there's a significant question of equity in the transformative change. It's much more about what energy can do for society rather than what energy can do for, say, major users of energy in industry. So the idea is it's much more focused on equity, and social justice is really at the core of it. And this change also sees the current climate crisis as an opportunity for transformative change. And here, I must admit, I'm reminded of Naomi Klein's recent book, where she says that the title of the book is "This Changes Everything." And I think the climate crisis is an opportunity for us to reevaluate the way we do things across all sectors of society, and that includes the way we produce energy and the way we consume energy. And the just energy transition, I think, should be seen as part of a much more holistic transition to a more just society. So we have transitions taking place in housing, in transport, in the way we produce and consume food. So it's in new ways of thinking about these issues. And one example would be the growth of transition towns, especially in the UK, that are trying to actually reimagine society in a different way. One other core aspect of the transformative change is that workers must be protected during the transition. And that comes from the very start right the way through to the eventual community ownership of energy. And I think the point to be made is that it's a deeply political undertaking. And this is where it goes back to the original point where I was talking about conversations that we were having of how we would go about doing this report, is that it dawned on us very quickly that you can't talk about this without realizing that it's a very political transition, and obviously it's going to be a very contested transition because of the politics that are in it. As Tasneem Issop recently stated, it really does represent a paradigm shift in our thinking, because what it implies is systemic change. It's technically challenging, and of course it's politically challenging. And I think as part of the conversation today, I think from our point of view, we want to recognize that this transition isn't going to happen quickly. It's obviously going to take time. I think we have to be sensitive to all role players, and it's going to take a lot of commitment and a lot of patience from role players as well. So it's a shift to what has been euphemistically described as community energy, and this is where I'm going to go now with the presentation, to look at the various options within the so-called transformative change that present this version of community energy. So what is community energy? Well, the International Renewable Energy Agency has this definition, which was actually taken from the World Wind Energy Association's definition from 2011. And it basically states that to be defined as community energy, two of these three requirements need to be met. So local stakeholders own the majority of the project, control rests with the local stakeholders, and the majority of social and economic benefits are distributed locally. And whereas this is obviously only one definition, I think it's important to recognize there are obviously different definitions. Governments, for example, the British government throws around the notion of community energy and pretty much describes any energy project that is localized in nature as community energy. But it doesn't meet with this kind of internationally recognized understanding of what community energy is. So there are various community models that, in terms of the transformative aspects of what a just energy transition implies, do not promise to meet those objectives. For example, there's something called the open investment model. And this is where citizens are invited to invest in renewable energy projects. And they're generally localized in nature, but there's a minimum threshold of investment. So this is obviously a very exclusionary way of getting community members actually involved in a project. There's also the so-called community benefit or community negotiated compensation model. And in this model, the community itself liaises with the developer, and the developer makes some kind of gesture to the community. And there's also the community connected or the split ownership model. And this is perhaps a more interesting model. In 2009, the Danish government passed legislation around renewable energies because they were concerned that the private sector was entering the market on a more aggressive basis that said at least 20% of ownership must go to the local community. Then there's also the purely for profit option. This can be very much community owned. It could even be 100% community owned. And investments here can start from maybe 200 euros. So it becomes much more accessible to people. But it's only those who actually benefit from the investment. So there's no sense in which the whole community is benefiting from this particular model. What does the model look like for a just economic transition? Generally, it's non-profit. It's community owned and community controlled. 90% of them take the form of cooperatives. So there's a minimal investment up front, or in some cases no investment up front. Often it's a tokenistic investment up front. All revenue is recycled, which is often the conditions of a cooperative. And no matter how big the investment you make in a project, you only ever get one vote. So it's obviously very democratic, and it's a localized decision-making process. This is the Hide Sande wind farm, which is in Denmark. And it's 100% owned by this community foundation. It's a 3 megawatt wind farm, financed by local residents and businesses, mostly through donations, and all profits get returned to the community, and the foundation decides how that money is going to be spent, what kind of developments it's going to be spent on. And it makes plus minus 18 million rand a year, which goes back into the community. What they've chosen to do is a lot of community development projects around education in particular. Then there's the Creoles in Brazil, which is a cooperative established in 1999. 20,000 members, has 6 hydro plants, and it's recently purchased a wind farm that was already generating electricity. Now, Creoles is very interesting because it actually generates electricity itself and sells it to its members. But it's very democratically organized, and there's a very strong social justice commitment. So it has a sliding scale of tariffs, and all profit is returned into additional capacity. It also has 800 families that get their electricity completely for free because they can't afford to pay for anything. And there are also grace periods. So if somebody finds they're in economic distress, they can approach Creoles and they can say, look, I need 6 months where you don't bill me. And they've agreed to do this. So you can see there's a real commitment to community development and community solidarity within this project. Then there's Son Energia in Spain. Now this is a cooperative again, 55,000 members, but this is a slightly different idea. This is a cooperative of interests. So these members are spread across all of Spain, and they have 6 solar PV, 1 biogas, and 1 hydro plant. It's 100 euros to join, and they raise money through share issues to members and ethical loans from banks. But they also have the principle that 1 member, 1 vote, no matter how much you invest in a project. And again, all profits are returned, and they're returned to a trust, which then either invests in more renewable capacity or in community development projects. So what we looked at now were the success factors. And the first success factor is policy certainty. And obviously policy certainty is something we're crying out for in South Africa. And I think in terms of a just energy transition, and the particular importance here into any kind of community development is that policy certainty enables financing. The second success factor, and this was absolutely universal across all the projects I looked at, was a feed-in tariff. And that, for exactly the same reason, it creates certainty of income and it allows projects to gain finance from the private sector if it need be, or from development banks. And then there's also obviously the question of financial support for development. So this would take the form of soft loans from government and tax incentives. Another issue that's come up clearly as a success factor in these projects is having grid access, which is obviously a major issue in South Africa. There's also the issue of local government support. It's quite clear that in lots of places in Europe, there's been a lot of support from government in terms of setting regional targets for RE energy, making land available, having particular forms of spatial planning that are conducive to locally produced energy, and the ability of obviously to procure energy from RE sources. And I think that's insightful given the City of Cape Town's current attempts to be able to buy energy from RE sources. There's also the right to sell electricity to members. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. One of the other factors is the social justice commitment. That is also a form of kind of entrepreneurialism. Members in the community actually wanting to do something for the wider good. What does the JET mean for Eskom? What kind of restructuring will be necessary? What does it mean in terms of grid access for Eskom? we've had the National Planning Commission, we've got the Just Energy Transition partner dialogue happening within the NPC at the moment. So hopefully we can get some policy clarity, and that can then appear in the IRP. Financing. Is there potential for a feed-in tariff in South Africa? I know they were deemed illegal in terms of Treasury regulations. Does that mean we need a legislative change? What is the role of state finance institutions? Fossil fuel subsidies. Is this a potential source of financing? Despite the limitations of the carbon tax, can revenue from the carbon tax be ring-fenced for community projects? The role of municipal government, expanded role, but then if more and more people go off the grid, what does it mean for municipal revenue? Technical support. Can we have some kind of national community energy support service like they have in Scotland? We need to increase public awareness around the benefits of not just RE, but also community ownership. And I think there's obviously a role for government and civil society there. What is the role of NERSA? And the critical role that unions are going to play in all this. Somewhat distressingly, so far they've been absent from NPC discussions. But I think it's interesting to contrast NUMSA's litigation with the recent AMCU statement. So lastly, can REAP be modified to deliver a JET? Or do we need to scrap it? Do we need to rethink it? And what role, if any, is there for the small renewable projects within the IPP? And we've seen they've complained about disproportionate transaction costs. South African banks have not invested at all in these projects. The DBSA actually had to step in, and even then, 60% are still foreign financed. Are these indicative of the kind of problems that smaller local projects are going to find? So, to conclude, it's it's going to be very gradual, there's clearly no quick fix. The idea maybe to have some pilot projects to see what works, to see what doesn't work. And I think it's an understanding that citizens, unions, government, private sector, all critical role players in this. And I just want to state that sometimes it seems like a huge issue, it's a huge investment, it's a big planning project. And there's been some kind of negative pushback to some of the things and discussions I've had already. But the thing is, just remember the World Cup. The amount of money that we suddenly found for the World Cup and the infrastructure, the development that went on then. When there's the political will, we can do these things. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks.
I'm just wondering what ownership forms there would be for supplying electricity to industry and business, because that's where the jobs for workers are. And until we move to a socialist society, we live in a society where workers need jobs. So how, in a just transition, what are the other ownership forms that we need in order to make sure that industry and business are getting the electricity they need?
There's obviously enormous potential for industry to have off-grid solutions. I mean, I flew back from Johannesburg this last week, and as you fly out the airport, there's just acres and acres of roof space from all the warehouses and things, and there's very little off-grid solar on those. So I think there is an opportunity there, and obviously that doesn't represent community-owned. In terms of wider issues around the state and how it provides for industry, I think that's, I don't have the answer to that question. I think that's what needs to come out of today's discussions. What does that look like? How do we provide energy for the energy-intensive users group, for example? I mean, the research was very much focused on communities and what communities wanted. So, I mean, to be honest with you, we didn't really explore those kind of wider issues.
I mean, a lot of the examples were European examples where communities have resources that they can use and draw on. In a context in Africa, and I'm not just talking about South Africa, but in the whole of Africa, where the greatest need for electricity is among the poorest communities. How do you finance that renewable energy? And what worries me is that there's a possibility of even this very community-based renewable energy leading to greater inequality if some communities are able to get the financing and get their act together to set up a cooperative and get their electricity. What about a poor community which has no resources, no capacity, just doesn't even know where to begin to do anything?
In terms of finance, I entirely agree with you. We can't have a situation where certain communities can afford to go off and build their own energy source at the cost to other communities that then get left with Eskom. And I think we've got some problems here already where we're seeing people going off grid. and then the kind of cross-subsidization towards poorer households gets weakened. So I think we need to be really careful about that. And where the funding comes from, that's obviously for the debate for today. Where does that funding come from? And in terms of knowledge and capacity, I think I touched on that in the research report about having some kind of national support structure like they've got in Scotland that gives advice, that empowers communities. And again, I think there's a role there for civil society and clearly for government.
Do you think this energy model will be good in SA? Then if yes, how would we monitor it and check corruption won't occur within it? Because we know the tender system in South Africa, there's corruption involved.
That's also a very difficult question to answer. I mean, we obviously need systems in place. We need community ownership to be really democratically managed. We need oversight and accountability mechanisms. And we need action to take place if people are involved in corruption at the local level through community energy projects.
If ESCOM can be able to supply 30 households, is it possible this model can be able to supply 30 households for 5 years? Is it possible? So that we can check whether if we're introducing it, we will be able to have electricity that is sustainable, so that we must not have a power failure.
In terms of how many households, will it be sustainable? Yes, it will be sustainable. And I mean, obviously it depends on the size of the kind of capacity of the energy source that you're talking about. But there's no reason why an energy source is going to be any less reliable than ESCOM. In fact, it's probably likely to be more reliable than ESCOM. So these are sustainable energy sources in terms of kind of the personal use on a household level.
Sandra's already alluded to, apart from thanking Neil, to the critical role that we envisage for the state at its various levels. The question is, to what extent have you been able to start the discussions with any of those levels, and what responses are you getting?
This is very much a scoping report. It was entirely based on secondary material. We haven't explored government attitudes to any of these issues. Maybe that's the next report, and that's the kind of process that we need to engage in.
May I also just comment on the term jet? Sounds okay, but by introducing the E, energy, are we not restricting the just transition just to energy, rather than keeping it as a much more open-ended just transition?
Partly, again, that's what the research asked me to look at, very specifically with that E in the middle. But I entirely agree with you, it needs to be part of a just transition, of which energy is only one part. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks.